So, recently, abortion news swelled in the media. On community chatter, social media, all the news feeds. Obviously, there's a lot going on. Most all of us probably know something about that. And as it really hit the floor running about a month ago, the Spirit spoke to the leaders here at Refuge. Not just me, it was on my heart, but it was also on your elder Ben Keller's heart, Mark Sanders' heart, and also just as well as pragmatism. Quite frankly, and most of our sermons, as I said, are expositional, so they're just moving through a book of the Bible, but sometimes topical is important because they're timely. And if the church remains silent on significant issues while the entire rest of the world shouted and argued or mumbled or whispered, to have no voice? Omission, biblically, can be as much of a sin as commission, doing something. So we felt compelled to speak to it and use the topical space we use between books, like today, to speak to it. And I want us all to be challenged. Honestly, I've been challenged in the last 3-4 weeks preparing. I've been challenged that I myself have been complacent. I've been spiritually attacked, honestly, this last week just prepping for this message. In fact, my whole family has. So in the spirit of family, I want to begin. I want to just dive right in because as I was prepping, I'd actually forgotten. I stumbled across it unintentionally. A testimony of actually somebody I know quite well, a friend I've been a ministry partner with in years past, a godfather to his children. So as you watch this, as I introduce you first here to my friend A.J. Hamilton, just understand that. This isn't somebody just found online. This is someone that I know intimately, I've known personally, a godfather to his kids. And so I want us to start by listening to a portion of A.J. Hamilton's testimony that he gave back in 2009.
Whenever I'm asked what my testimony is, I find that I have to tell it in the context of my parents' testimony. And so I'll tell you about my mom. And I didn't make it through the first one very well, so I doubt I'll do it on this one too. But my mom, in her early 20s, she did not know the Lord, was running with the bad crowd. And one day, she was hanging out with a guy who had given her a joint that was laced with a date rape drug. And he proceeded to rape her, and she knew immediately that she had conceived. So when she went home to her family, and she told them that she was pregnant by rape, many of them demanded that she have an abortion, and this would have been her second. But Jesus, seeing this messed up situation, reached down into my mom's life and gave her a ton of grace, saved her, showed her that this child was a blessing, and she kept the child, and that child is me. A really cool thing happened about 2 years later. A really godly man came into our lives and looked at a woman with a child out of wedlock by rape and married her and adopted me. I grew up in a Christian home, so I knew very early that Jesus had saved me and could see a lot of grace, his grace in my life. In '99, I was still a teenager. I got married to my lovely wife, and my dad was my best man. And last month, we just celebrated, Crystal and I, 10 years of marriage. We have 4 kids.
You're going to have the opportunity to meet some other men and women today. And I want us to be moved. I want us to be provoked. Provoking of our spirit is where we test and discern what God's will is, as Romans tells us. Father, help my words, help my spirit, help my pounding heart. As this is indeed for many of us, hopefully all of us, I pray, an emotional issue, but also one where we employ the reason and guidance of your word. In your name, amen. I actually want to roll back from AJ's story about 2,000 years to a letter from a Roman citizen to his pregnant wife dated 1 BC. He says to his wife, and this was actually unearthed, this is real from archaeologists that have found it. in recent years. She says, "I'm still in Alexandria. I beg and plead with you to take care of our little child, and as soon as we receive wages, I will send them to you. In the meantime, if, good fortune to you, you give birth. If it's a boy, let it live. If it's a girl, expose it." Expose it. Exposure of newborns was widely practiced in ancient Greece and Rome. It was even advocated by Aristotle in the case of congenital deformity. Aristotle said, "As to the exposure of children, let there be a law that no deformed child shall live." Notice it's not murder, it's just exposure. It's the preferred method of disposal. If a woman had a baby, she would show it to her husband, and if it was illegitimate, unhealthy, deformed, the wrong sex, too great a burden on the family, it would not be directly killed. It would be put in a clay pot or a jar and deserted outside, sometimes on the front door, or sometimes in the roadway, or sometimes out into the woods so that the wolves could have it. This practice allegedly took the responsibility away from the parents because the child died of natural causes. We didn't murder it, we just exposed it. Now, Roman historians at the time also wrote about the customs of other people, strange people, right? Who often diverged from their own practices. Tacitus and Josephus in the 1st century wrote that according to both the Jews and the early Christians, God forbids abortion of what is begotten or to destroy it afterwards. You know, even I was surprised to hear exposure and abortion used side by side simultaneously in the 1st century. It's not new. Exposure was simply, in many respects at that time in history, much safer and easier for the woman and the whole family. Thus, the 1st century Christians became people who recognized, okay, Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies. As Jews, we know this is wrong. The 1st century Christian writing the Didache said, "Thou shalt not kill a child by abortion, neither shalt thou slay it when born." Abortion and infanticide appear in early writings side by side, simultaneously condemned since the time of Jesus. To Christians, the infant had value. Culture placed much different type of value on human life in Rome's day. Christians treated them as human beings. Infanticide was unequivocally murder, not a convenient tool of family planning. And some would argue at the time that the quality of life of these children would be lesser. But the Christian argued not for the quality of life, but for the inherent value of it. That's a big difference. The baby, whether male, female, perfect or imperfect, was created in the image and likeness of God and so had value. Now, Christianity in that day, the 1st century AD, was disfavored. It was sometimes even persecuted as a religion, so appeals to the government to act against infanticide were ineffectual in changing government policy. Christians worked against infanticide by prohibiting its members from practicing it, by voicing their moral view to those around them, and by actually taking in and supporting babies which had been left to die by their parents. 318 years later, we do see the Emperor Constantine being against it, and some legislation being made that prohibited it. But it wasn't until 375 AD that Emperor Valentinian, a Christian, finally outlawed the practice of infanticide in the Roman Empire. Now, few would argue with me. You'd be hard-pressed to find anyone today who would argue with the assertion that Christians were on the right side of history. In fact, I read just recently in the headlines, a woman was just sentenced to life imprisonment in California because she took her 10-month-old baby, put it in a microwave, and aborted its life. And we would look at that and we would say, that's terrible. Exposing this child to the microwave, exposure as murder, is without question. But in New York, right now, if she'd just been a few months quicker, it would have been applauded. Now, why be angry with this woman? Why be angry with this woman in California? Could that baby have survived on its own? No. Was it wholly contingent on a mother? Yes. It had only just come from her body. Why isn't it her choice to do with it as she pleases? What In fact, how can we judge her? Do we know her story? Well, apparently we do, because she's serving life in prison. Like, how did we get to this dichotomous place as a culture where we have divided two things in a way that one is absolute mortification to our spirit, and one is now, where on late night talk shows, they have comedy about it? I want to defer to my brother Mark to talk a little bit about the history of this issue.